Gravitas, co-presented by Škoda. Kushaq, choose what really matters.
Joining me in our New York studio is Suhag A. Shukla. She is the executive director of and the co-founder of the Hindu American Foundation. She's also served as a member in the faith-based security and communication subcommittee of the Department of Homeland Security here in the US. And Vibhuti Jha, a political analyst and managing director at Global Capital Service Group. He's been instrumental in promoting business ties between India and the US. Suhag and Vibhuti, welcome to Beyond.
Thank you.
I'll start with you. This is what the Prime Minister said today. Democracy can and has delivered. It's a big statement by the Indian Prime Minister, and there's a general feeling that democracy is too slow, that hybrid communism like the China model worked better, but he's saying that democracy has delivered. Do you think that India's rise can be an advertisement for the effectiveness of democracy?
Absolutely. I think that, India has demonstrated that it's not just on a path to leadership, but is a leader. And that's why India has become such an important partner to the United States. Democracy can be messy, but democracy is the way that you can get buy-in from all the stakeholders, and in order to kind of move forward in a way that allows individual flourishing, democracy really is the only model.
Yes, and a lot of subtle statements there. So when he talks about democracy, then there is probably a reference to China. When he talks about terrorism, there's a reference to Pakistan. A big pitch for vaccines also. The Prime Minister has invited the world's big companies, vaccine producers, to make in India. Clearly, India wants to take a lead in fixing the situation post the pandemic. How do you see India's efforts in this direction?
I believe that India is heading in the right direction for the simple reason that the Prime Minister is very determined to allay the fears of democracy doesn't work. And if you look at it seriously, democracy was never designed to be an efficient or effective economic mechanism. It is a political tool of governance in which you have a constant check and balance between the executive, judiciary, and the legislature. No one must begin to have a supremacy in trying to rule. So in the economic affairs, as a banker, I can tell you, we always talk about efficiency of capital, effectiveness in performance, and delivering outcomes. In democracy, this is all a delayed item. Things take time to happen. And as a result of which, Prime Minister's message today, that in the Indian context, democracy has delivered, is a signal to everybody that China model faster in relation to democracy, but democracy remains the best tool in terms of achieving equality and equity that is required in the current world that we are talking about. So I think he proved it. India is leading the whole thing. As a matter of fact, despite US interference in supplying the raw materials, which affected India adversely, today US is asking India to open up and start exporting. So this is the recognition of the fact that things can happen, and they do, provided one is inclined to do that and brings about that commitment. So that's the important part.
You said India is already a leader, and speaking as a leader, the Prime Minister said that the United Nations faces the prospect of irrelevance if it does not reform itself. How far has India been able to underscore this point, that it is time for the UN to reform and to give countries like India a seat at the high table?
Exactly. I mean, that is, in terms of the type of work and model that India is providing in terms of a secular democracy in the region is immeasurable. You have, a country that's surrounded by autocratic, failing states, essentially, where human rights are a great challenge. So India absolutely needs to have a permanent seat on the UN Security Council. I think there's things that the United States can do as well. As a partner, India remains a non-NATO ally, and Pakistan is a non-NATO ally. And I think that the United States has to this kind of cognitively dissonant relationship with Pakistan, because Pakistan is undermining stability in the region. It's undermining American interests in the region. It's undermining Afghan interests in the region, as well as Indian interests, obviously, because that's where India is. So reform is necessary. I think that the countries that are emerging and developing need to have a seat at the table, and the first step will be for India to be made a permanent member.
The conversations over the past 2 or 3 days have all centered around Chinese expansionism, the role of Pakistan and its duplicity, the Afghanistan challenge. I think that's personally, from what I've observed, I believe that that's a problem that the Americans want to not talk about anymore. That's something that they've left behind, but it is very much a concern for India. How tangible would you say has been the takeaway for the Indian contingent when it comes to telling its allies and partners that these are the problems that we need to focus on if we are going to be working together?
Absolutely essential. And the point of the matter is here that this is an annual jamboree that happens in New York. Everybody knows that the heads of state come and make their speeches and go back. What happened? And as a result of which, there is a mistrust of the United Nations. And even United Nations knows that it's no longer effective. It's just a spokesperson for some problem or the other. Things don't move in the UN. And there are entities like China and Pakistan, which Suhag was talking about, if they take advantage of the rule-based systems. Think about it like this. Pakistan is still demanding evidences against 2611 perpetrators in India. How ridiculous is that? So when these two countries are systematically taking advantage of the rule of law, and this has to be dismantled. And I think from my perspective, everything else said apart, the reform of United Nations, that United Nations to be effective, and Prime Minister used that word, that if you want to be prabhavashali and you want to be effective, you have to show action. How can you allow entities like this, who are hated by the world today? This is, people for politically correct reasons may not say so, but hey, Marco Rubio said it in a Senate hearing that Pakistan is a third-rate country. So for a senator who was a presidential candidate to make that statement is very profound, very strong, because all these intelligence subcommittee, they knew. But one thing which I want to point out here is that the US getting out of Afghanistan has ended two things. One is US reliance on Pakistan for supply as a supply chain entity for US forces, food and equipment included, and paying the rent for that. That has ended. So in my opinion, politically speaking, US is perhaps for the first time experiencing true freedom. Ab main kuch kar sakta hu. Like I can now no longer rely upon, Pakistan is an ally and all that, which itself is a ridiculous thing to happen. So I think these directional shifts that are happening, China nobody likes because of their killer contracts and the bullying they do around the region. So India is becoming that pivot that for an economic and supply chain reasons, India is the country that will have to be your partner, and US recognizes that. That's why Kamala Harris, also the vice president, did not comment upon the human rights issue. She talked about the Pakistani intransigence. She talked about the COVID success of India. She did not raise any untoward issue in relation to India. So that's an important shift.
If I can just add to that, we do a lot of work on Capitol Hill at the Hindu American Foundation. And, 10 years ago, any conversation that we were having with members of Congress on Pakistan, there was just kind of silent nodding. Now, just in this past few weeks, we had 3 amendments to the National Defense Authorization Act calling on the demotion of Pakistan as a non-NATO ally, cutting off of funding, and also asking the State Department to designate it as a state sponsor of terrorism. I don't think that would have happened 10 years ago. So I would agree with you that this exit from Afghanistan has really, I think, opened things up where people on the Hill at least can be more honest.
And we were also making a comparison, although there is no comparison, because the Pakistani leader spoke and he mentioned Kashmir, 15 times. He mentioned India 17 times or something like that. I don't have the exact numbers. He mentioned Islamophobia. He mentioned Taliban. He mentioned terrorists. He keeps saying that give the Taliban a fair chance. Compare that to Prime Minister Modi's speech where he's talking about democracy, he's talking about development, technology, climate change, green hydrogen. Do you see the gap? There is one leader who's constantly complaining and another who's saying that when we, as you said, when we reform, the world transforms, and that is what we're working towards.
Exactly. I mean, it's just, the Prime Minister spoke as a member of the World Alliance. Pakistan is kind of just stuck in the neighborhood. And so I think that begs the question as to why Pakistan enjoys the type of access to the UN, the types of access to the US government. And I think that what was also really telling was the way in which Prime Minister Modi even started his speech, talking about kind of this Indian ethos of integral humanism, which to me is another way of just describing dharma, a way of being selfless, that, you know, the world is interconnected. This pandemic showed this to us in very real ways. And so that means that our well-being is interdependent. And that is the type of message that he conveyed, and I think that his policies are showing largely.
And gave his own example very interestingly as what democracy can deliver.
Exactly.
He said that I was a tea seller, now I've gone on to become the Prime Minister of the world's biggest democracy. I'm out of time, but Suhag and Vibhuti, thanks very much for sharing your thoughts with us. It was a very powerful speech at the United Nations General Assembly with the Indian Prime Minister speaking like a world leader. WION is now available in your country. Download the app now and get all the news on the move.
Gravitas, co-presented by Skoda. Kushaq, choose what really matters.